Confusion over U.S. plans for Syria. Donald Trump is facing criticism for his decision to withdraw from the northeast, paving the way for a Turkish offensive. What are the risks of a military operation and what to do with Isil fighters in Kurdish prisons? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly by Thibault. The White House is sending mixed messages about the future of America's role in Syria. President Donald Trump announced on Monday that U.S. soldiers would pull out of northeastern Syria, allowing Turkey to launch a military operation against Kurdish fighters. Turkey's defense minister says its forces are ready to enter and clear what he calls terrorists. Syrian Kurds, America's close ally in the fight against Isil, called Trump's decision a stab in the back. And after widespread criticism at home, the president is now threatening to destroy Turkey's economy if it does anything he considers to be off limits. But a White House official says U.S. soldiers are only being moved within Syria rather than fully withdrawn, contradicting the president's earlier tweet that the U.S. would, quote, get out of the war. Well, we have a lot to get to with our guests, but first, this report from Kimberly Halkett in Washington, D.C.
As U.S. troops begin pulling out of positions in northern Syria, their commander-in-chief, Donald Trump, defended his decision to withdraw.
Now we've captured ISIS. We've done what we've done. We had 50 soldiers in the area you're talking about. And I said, we want to bring our soldiers back home. It's been a long time.
It's a major shift in U.S. foreign policy, one being criticized by members of the president's own Republican Party. Senator Lindsey Graham, one of Trump's biggest supporters on Twitter, pledged to reverse the withdrawal in the U.S. Senate, calling it a disaster in the making, a move also backed by the top Democrat in the Senate.
Now I can tell you this, it is getting broad condemnation from Democrats and Republicans. And I expect Congress will take some form of action, either a resolution or something even more.
U.S. officials credit Kurdish forces with helping take back territory from Isil in northern Syria. But there are tensions between Turkey and the Kurds. The Turkish government considers one of its most effective fighting forces, the PKK, to be a terrorist organization. Some U.S. lawmakers are threatening to sanction Turkey, potentially calling for its suspension from NATO if it attacks Kurdish forces in northern Syria. But Trump went even further, threatening to economically obliterate Turkey if the Kurds are attacked.
I have told Turkey that if they do anything outside of what we would think is humane, they could suffer the wrath of an extremely decimated economy.
Still, Trump has long been vocal about his desire to get the U.S. out of what he calls America's endless wars. Trump's impulsive Syria strategy has led to key members of his administration resigning. Last year, his defense secretary James Mattis and Brett McGurk, Trump's ISIL special envoy.
What this shows is President Trump, unlike all of his predecessors, whether Republican or Democratic, is only concerned about himself. We have a moral responsibility to the Kurds because without them, we would not have destroyed the caliphate.
In a statement on Monday, the Pentagon made clear to Turkey the United States does not back Turkish operations in northern Syria, believing it will have a destabilizing effect on the region. President Trump campaigned in 2016, promising to withdraw the United States from foreign wars. Now, with the 2020 U.S. election just a little more than a year away, it appears potential voters, not his senior advisors, are the ones Trump cares about pleasing most. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, the White House.
So let's take a look at how others have responded to Trump's decision. Nikki Haley, who served as Trump's first U.S. ambassador to the UN, said, "We must always have the backs of our allies if we expect them to have our back. The Kurds were instrumental in our successful fight against ISIS in Syria. Leaving them to die is a big mistake. Hashtag Turkey is not our friend." U.S. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell warned the move would damage relations with Turkey and only benefit Russia, Iran, and Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. France, another ally in the U.S. fight against ISIL, is worried the armed group could re-emerge, while Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif called the U.S. an irrelevant occupier in Syria. He warned Turkey against any military operation. Well, let's bring in our guest for today's show. In Washington, D.C., we have Giran Ozchan. He's the People's Democratic Party representative to the United States, a Kurdish opposition group in Turkey, also known as the HDP. In Istanbul, we have Osman Sert, director of the Ankara Institute and former advisor to Turkish Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoglu. And in Washington, D.C., on Skype, Wael Al-Zayat. He served as a senior Syria advisor to Samantha Power, a former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Giran Ozchan in Washington, if I can start with you, what is your understanding of the Trump administration's announcement of the future U.S. role in Syria's war? Is the U.S. administration endorsing a Turkish offensive in northern Syria? And are they abandoning your people, the Kurds?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, firstly. I think the very short and simple answer to that is we just simply do not know yet. Because in the last year and a half, President Trump has tried to leave Syria on two previous occasions, on both being severely pushed back by the American establishment. On the second time in December in 2018, when President Trump said that he had ordered the military to actually leave Syria, the crisis grew so much that the defense secretary of the time, James Mattis, had resigned over it. And then subsequently, Brett McGurk also resigned over President Trump's decision to withdraw. Now, we know that after that decision, pressure from Congress especially had President Trump backtracking a little bit and actually slowing down the withdrawal. Although a very limited withdrawal took place, the US and President Trump himself also said that the American soldiers would stay longer.
Wael, what are your thoughts? The prevailing narrative has always been that the Americans won't abandon the Kurds who fought and defeated ISIL. What do you make of the confusing statements coming from the U.S. administration? Does the U.S. support a Turkish operation in northern Syria?
You know, I wouldn't say that the prevailing sentiment was that the United States would never abandon the Kurds. In fact, history proves otherwise. Those of us who were in the previous administration, like myself, always pointed out that while partnering with the PKK affiliate in northern Syria was expedient and useful against ISIS in the short term, it was always going to be problematic in the long term because they are the #1 enemy of a NATO ally to their north. And that's reflective right now in the contradictory statements, confusion, and near hysteria you're seeing in Washington now over this situation, where you have, on the one hand, those who have invested in this relationship, seeing their hard work, being let go, and a president who's erratic and issues foreign policy from Twitter at 3 a.m. But is forced into a corner by President Erdogan.
Even the White House seemed to walk back the president's withdrawal comment. Do you think President Trump was just perhaps trying to divert attention from the domestic issues? Wael?
That's very possible with this president. But at the end of the day, he was steamrolled, as they say, by President Erdogan of Turkey on this issue. And he really has a very weak hand to play, even if he was the most perfect president we've ever had, which he is not. He has a very weak card. We have a few hundreds of soldiers in the north, and the Turkish army is hell-bent on coming across. So his choices were either to watch them do it against his objection or to say that he agreed to it.
Oh, let's bring in Osman Sert in Istanbul. Osman, some reports have suggested that even the Turks were caught by surprise by the president's announcement of U.S. troops withdrawal from northern Syria. I wonder what's going on in their minds right now with this threat by the U.S. president to obliterate Turkey's economy if, in his words, they do anything he considers off limits. What are the Turks making of all this?
Indeed, if you are looking at the issue from Ankara and Istanbul, you can see that there is a mess standing over there. Okay, and this mess is a Washington mess, not a mess of Turkish-American relations. On the one hand side, there's a president just between hours, he is telling that he is endorsing a Turkish possible operation in northern Syria, and secondly, he is just threatening Turkey through tweets to devastate the Turkish economy. On the other side, the Pentagon, which should be ruled by the president, it is dragging its feet to apply the orders of the president. And that's why when you look at the issue from Turkey's perspective, it is a mess. And this mess is an American mess. The Trump administration's, Mr. Trump's first priority is to be re-elected in the coming elections and to deal with this impeachment process. And for the Congress and the others, they need to fight with Trump. And unfortunately, the discussion about Turkey is just becoming a tool for this fight indeed. Right.
But you say this is an American mess, but Turkey has a big role to play in this as well. I mean, will there be a Turkish military operation? Everything seems to indicate that this will be the case, but the question is, what will be the scope of any operation? What will be the initial focus, and how far will Turkish troops push into northern Syria?
Of course, it's a fact that there's a Turkish role, what's happening in this problem, but when you look at the issue from, what kind of an ally you have it standing at the other side of the table, with whom you will be negotiating, with whom you will be having a deal regarding an operation. Okay, you may disagree with the operation, you may disagree with the Turkish politics in Syria, but what kind of a politics, what kind of a counterpart you have regarding the operation? Turkey is ready to make an operation now. It did twice in the region, in Afrin and Euphrates Shield region, and then the Turkish army is ready. Just as far as I touched to the officials over there, they are ready to make it. Yes, there are some limitations regarding airfield or something like that, but without the air protection, such kind of an operation can be tackled. Turkey did it, and it has an experience on that. The problem is that we are discussing about the American policy on Syria. I think the main problem is that whether America has a policy on Syria, not about Trump, starting from the Obama period, is if there is a coherent, consistent Syria policy. I think this is another very important point.
All right, Giran, let me bring you back in. Osman says the Turks are ready to go in. How concerned are you about the protection of Kurdish people in northern Syria when the Turkish tanks roll in, both in terms of sovereignty and also maintaining safety in the area? How big of a risk is this operation?
Well, it's an absolutely huge risk because we don't have to look anywhere else. We can just see what the Turkish security forces did in the predominantly Kurdish cities in southeastern Turkey only a few years back, only in 2015 and 2016. Turkish tanks and heavy artillery demolished 10 cities in southeast Turkey when fighting certain Kurdish rebels there. So we don't have to look too far into the future to be very concerned about what this operation into northern Syria would do, because we're talking about an area that, relatively speaking, has been the most stable part of the country, of Syria, since the 2011 uprisings began. And so for Turkey to actually want to destabilize and attack a region that hasn't threatened Turkey, that hasn't had any instability of its own, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And I think that the legitimization or the rationalization that's offered by Turkey, by the Turkish government, doesn't make much sense either, because what the Turkish government is saying is that the Kurds in northeastern Syria, northern Syria, are affiliated to the PKK somehow. Now, the PKK is a movement that the Turkish government sat down with between 2013 and 2015 politically to try and solve the Kurdish issue. Now, if you're able to sit down with the actual movement that has fought an insurgency against you directly, namely the PKK, then how can it be that a few years after you feel it necessary to actually cross a border into a completely different country and attack Kurds there for their so-called affiliation to the PKK? Now, I think international forces need to take note of this as well. There was a potential for peace between the Turkish government and the PKK, and I think the only way to solve all of this crisis and this tension is for international powers and the Turkish government as well to rethink its Kurdish policy and sit down with the very movement that it's itself fighting an insurgency in Turkey.
Osman in Istanbul, your thoughts on that? Why Giran says that the Turkish government needs to rethink its Kurdish policy, but it doesn't seem to be the case right now that they want to rethink. They just want to go in and clear the area from what they call terrorists. Are they likely to rethink this policy?
Thank you very much for. Yeah, thank you very much for this, just giving me a voice on that. Then just in order to clarify the issues for the audience, PKK is a terrorist organization labeled by the Americans, by the Europeans, by Turkey, which killed more than 30,000 Turkish and Kurdish people in the region. It is a very well-known terrorist organization. We need to underline this. This is number one. Regarding the Kurds in the region. Which Kurds we are talking about it? About the northern Iraqi Kurds, I'm talking about the KRG, Mr. Barzani and others. When they are facing up with ISIS, Turkey was rushing to help them, to contribute their military, to contribute their fight with ISIS, and Turkish help saved these quote-unquote Kurds from ISIS. Whether we are talking about the Kurds who escaped from YPG pressure in Syria, about 200,000 to 300,000 Kurds living in Turkey right now, escaping from the YPG region. Whether we are talking about these Kurds in the region, we are talking about YPG, which is affiliated with PKK, and it is not so-called affiliation.
Okay,
the American officials are accepting that
please.
this is the affiliation is very obvious, and the Americans itself, they know that it was unsustainable for the Americans to keep the balance between just saving the PKK in the region and keeping Turkey calm.
Osman, let's allow Giran to respond briefly before I bring back Wael into the conversation. Giran, your response.
Firstly, just to correct several figures, I mean, over 40,000 people have lost their lives inside Turkey in the conflict between the PKK and Turkey, and more than half of the total casualties have been on the side of the PKK and the Kurds. So let's firstly get that straight. Now, the categorization of the PKK as a terrorist organization, yes, okay, the US and certain states and Western states and Turkey see the PKK as a terrorist organization, but then is your guest in Istanbul, in Turkey, saying that the Turkish government sat down with a terrorist organization? Because I don't think he can reject the truth that the Turkish government sat down with the PKK between 2013 and 2015, and this was the right thing to do because there's absolutely no reason to perpetuate this conflict right now. The Turkish government took the PKK as the other side of this conflict and sat down and tried to solve this age-old question.
Okay,
now,
gentlemen,
that's why I don't think the old discourse and rhetoric holds any water anymore.
All right, gentlemen, of course, as you know, another major concern is what will happen to nearly 12,000 ISIL fighters held by Kurdish forces in Syria if indeed Turkey goes ahead with this operation. Some 2,000 of them are foreign fighters, including from France, Germany and the UK, but European governments have refused to take them back. Earlier, we spoke to a journalist, Molly Sweeney, who recently interviewed people trapped in northeastern Syria. Take a listen.
The Turks have been threatening this area for years now, including throughout the time that the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, were fighting against ISIL as an American partner force. The fear of the people is compounded. Many of the people in the camps fear the regime and can't go home to their various parts of Syria and Iraq because of the regime or because of Iranian-backed forces there, and they fear for their lives. But they also fear a Turkish invasion from the north. These are people who are caught between a rock and a hard place.
All right. While in Washington, D.C., can any Turkish operation create a vacuum for ISIL to re-emerge in this area? The Americans seem to be preparing for such a scenario when they blame the Europeans for not taking back the ISIL fighters currently being held by the Kurds.
It's always a possibility if the SDF slash YPG fighters turn their attention to confront Turkey in the chaos. You can see ISIS fighters escaping, prisoners escaping, the groups reassembling and reemerging. But I think the problem of that happening once Turkey takes over is not necessarily as bad as everyone's making it out to be. Once Turkey takes over those areas, they're going to want to protect their interests. We may disagree with what those interests are, but the Turkish military is not going to allow ISIS fighters to roam around among them. The story of ISIS and Turkish, cooperation, quote unquote, really was at its worst in the early times of 2012, 2013, 2014, when Turkey was turning a blind eye to ISIS fighters who were fighting the Kurds. But certainly, I don't see them allowing them to roam free in areas once they take over it.
All right. Your thoughts, Osman, in Istanbul. What will happen to these ISIL fighters currently being held by the Kurds? The Americans seem to suggest that if Turkey goes in and goes ahead with this military operation, then they will be responsible for these ISIL fighters.
Exactly. I will touch upon, I want to add just a few sentences regarding, yes, Mr. Weil in Washington just clearly put it that Turkey sit table with PKK in order to reach at a solution. It was a very wise decision from my point of view, and PKK exploited this opportunity to stock ammunition in the cities, dig the streets in order to, and I will stop you because it's a very long discussion regarding what PKK is and what Turkey is trying to do regarding the ISIS issue.
Yes.
Exactly. The ISIS issue is, I think this is a blackmail just coming from the YPG forces in the region. They are telling that if Turkey is coming here, the ICC forces will be either released or they will be escaping. If everybody is against ISIS, okay? YPG, the Americans, and the Turks. And what is the problem over there? And regarding the number, I need to correct it because it was being exaggerated by the YPG forces in order to blackmail the Americans and the Europeans regarding the possible danger. It is about a few thousands with the families, okay? Regarding 12,000, and sometimes even they are just telling about tens of thousands of ISIL members as if like a town or a city. It is not the fact. There is a problem of ISIS. There should be a very smart planning regarding how to handle this ISIS members and families, but there is another side of the coin. The Europeans, these ISIS members are just belonging to these countries. They are not accepting their citizens. They just wanted these ISIS members leave over there and take care of it, either the YPG forces, the Kurds, or the Americans, or the Turks. The real owner of the problem, who sent, of course, not willingly, but just let them to go to the region, they are not trying to deal with the problem. And now the existing forces are blackmailing through ISIS to both the Americans, Turks, and the Europeans to stop any kind of operation.
All right, let's give Giran the last word. Giran, what will happen to these ISIL fighters being held by the Kurds, and will justice be served for the crimes that they purportedly committed?
2 points. Firstly, I think your guest here in DC, I think his optimism is unfounded. Firstly, I think if a government that enabled ISIS to grow very quickly in its early years, that didn't take precautions on its border, that according to some actually actively helped ISIS in its operational capacity, I would find very hard to trust, and I would not want to leave my security to a government that's done that before. And that's why I believe that the optimism that somehow the Turkish army and the Turkish government can take responsibility of these ISIS captives is completely unfounded. Secondly, I think it's quite rich from anyone that's been affiliated or still is affiliated to the Turkish government to talk about some sort of a threat by the SDF or YPG about the ISIS prisoners. The Turkish government, Erdogan, has been threatening Europe for the past few years with the more than 4 million Syrian refugees in the country, trying to take anything it can from Europe and from the Western world by threatening them with opening the doors to more than 4 million Syrian refugees to cross the borders into Europe. So I think it's quite rich from your guest in Istanbul to talk about how the SDF or YPG are doing this. The SDF, the Kurds in northeastern Syria, have very limited resources to look after and to actually hold these people accountable, the ISIS captives accountable. And if the Turkish army is going to attack the YPG and the Kurds in northeastern Syria, then they're going to have to defend themselves, and I think that will take, that will be a priority more than anything
we'll
else
leave it there,
the
gentlemen. Thank you so very much for a very interesting discussion. Thank you for joining us, Giran Ozchan, Osman Sert, and Wael Al Zayed. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.